Welcome back to the Sounds of the Baskerville. I'm James Flaherty. I'm here with Chris Baskerville, the star of the show, the Hound, Chris Baskerville.
Good morning, James.
Brisbane,
Good morning.
Josh Sutherland. Good to see you, Chris.
Good morning.
And here we are on a vodcast. So another vodcast. Today we've got a special guest, Chris. We've got Patrick Schweizer from Alares who's joined us. Great to see you, Patrick.
Yes, thank you, James. Thank you, Chris.
Good to
Welcome to the madness.
Welcome to that which is the Sounds of the Baskerville. But anyway, in our fourth season,
I am a prolific listener of the show and very, very proud to.
yes, we must be hitting double digits now.
Yeah,
That's great.
there's Chad.
Didn't you think, Chris? It's time to get the talent into the room and actually look into the whites of your eyes. And what is it that Alares actually does?
Yeah, so look, fundamentally, we are an aggregator of risk data. So we started off primarily focused on litigation and court data, and we've grown that over the years to include many other things. So obviously insolvency data, we include ATO data, building licenses, many other bits of information.
Oh, okay. So there's a whole bunch of different sources that you can get information in.
Exactly. So we compile all of that information from many different places into both point-in-time reports and alerts for people to help mitigate their risk.
I'm just really interested then in, so where does this, because I can go online and find some of this stuff, can't I? Like, I mean, if I can...
Not really. So the genesis of Alares, actually, we noticed a pattern that would often take place, which was company XYZ would go down, creditors would be left in the lurch, and oftentimes some of those creditors would be somewhat unaware that there was any trouble brewing. And what was interesting was some of the creditors that we intuitively thought they will be all over it and they will be sort of all knowing, they seemed to be the ones least in the know that there were problems brewing. And so when we dug a little bit deeper into this, we found, look, often, say it's a big bank or a credit provider, they will do a credit check, they will then decide to either lend money or provide products and services on credit terms. And what we found was within those credit reports, basically anything that's currently going through the law courts, or even most prior matters that had previously been through the courts, do not appear on credit reports.
Mm. Wow, so that's a massive gap, isn't it?
It's a significant gap. And so what we found was case study after case study of people getting themselves into very sticky situations where, had they only known what else was out there, they would have potentially done things very differently to help manage their risk.
I remember a story that your brother was involved in. I was lamenting about it this morning. So your brother was advising a guy looking at an acquisition, I think either air freight or airline, one of those two. And Alares has just come on the scene. They've run the risk report on the vendor that they're about to acquire this business for. And they're having discussions with the vendor, and then of course Oliver's client says, "Hey, can you just tell us a little bit about these three pieces of litigation that the company's involved in?" And the obvious response was, "How on God's green earth did you figure that out?" Needless to say, that acquisition didn't take place because the information was available to the person looking to acquire the business.
So there's a lot of cases. I mean, look at the tech bros in Silicon Valley. There's lots of people with a good idea. So if you've done something here where you've developed, you found a gap, you've developed an idea. So this isn't something that happened overnight, though, is it? So if we're talking about you were working at an organisation in Queensland some years ago, it's evolved over some time. Maybe you could take us just a bit through that journey. Like, well, how did you glue all this together? And tell us again just what's in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we came across this gap, the first question, of course, was, how could this possibly be? We go to reputable credit bureaus, we run reports, and the fact that, company XYZ or person XYZ is getting sued sort of by half a dozen different people, it just doesn't show up in the report. And, how could this possibly be. When we started to investigate that, it became very clear that while there may be one or two courts around the country that sort of have a registry that's easy enough to search online, most of them don't. And the information is, while it's ultimately in the public domain, it's very hard to really come by and to compile and to use in any meaningful way. So the first thing we did is we went around to people we knew, be it a lender or an insolvency practitioner or a company auditor, and we said, look, we're aware you use a process, we're aware that there's some very key data that you're actually not getting. Would it be useful for you if we could provide you this extra information? And sort of one by one, they all said, oh yeah. First of all, I didn't even realize that I wasn't getting it. But now that you've pointed it out to me, absolutely, this is sort of critical information that we need and want.
There'll be a whole bunch of people, hang on, do I not already get this? So there's a bit of you had to actually explain to them, no, you're not.
Exactly.
And you've got some already gives an example of how that could be quite bad. So then, okay, so you've got a bunch of people like the Baskervilles of the world to say, yeah, that might be an interesting idea. Okay, cool. So then what happens then?
So many initial discussions and meetings we had started exactly like that, where the person on the other side of the table would say, well, hang on, I'm with Credit Bureau XYZ and I already get all this information.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
And so what we then did is we built up a very large dossier of case studies to say, okay, here's a credit report, here's our report. Compare them side by side in the credit report. While it certainly provides a lot of useful information, the key point is it's not all encompassing and it doesn't include everything that you really ought to know.
And you built a great product. Sorry, Chris, you were going to say?
There's two elements to Alares. One is it's a searching tool. So if I want to look at someone or some party or some element, I'll find what they're currently involved in. But there's also the watch list element, which is I can put people's names and company names on a list. So whenever there's any movement in documents or activity within the legal process, it's going to flag to someone like me that there's been a change or an update.
Exactly right. And that's another key element where a lot of businesses rely on point-in-time reports where, hey, I'm about to do business with James or Chris. I can do a check on them. Everything checks out. Happy days. Well, what happens if next week or next month or 12 months down the track something changes that I might want to know about? We'll be able to give those alerts and updates in real time. It doesn't always mean, hey, there's some catastrophic issue, but at least it's something that you're now aware of. If you do need to, do something to sort of manage your risk in a different way, at least you know to do that. Because oftentimes what we find is, the first that a lender or a credit provider may know that there's an issue is when they get a call from Chris saying, I've just been appointed to
the administrator.
Because whilst a call from Chris can be pleasant.
It depends on what time of day it is. If it's getting close to lunch, it's probably a good...
Okay, so we'll probably go to how you use it in a little bit, Chris, but I suppose the thing I'm interested in is, so I'm a wholesaler, I got a bunch of different... And I get sick of the fact that, these people kind of drop off because they would trade with me one day and then they're not. Then they owe me money or whatever, and then suddenly they're gone. So would I have them on a watch list? All of my credit, all my clients will
Absolutely.
Be on okay, gotcha. So anytime, so that's you're saying. So anytime someone pings me, if I get a
just talking with the famous Schweizers is what I've gleaned is, say banks as an example, they put sort of customers on their watch list so that if there's any change to their customers, they'll be alerted. But I thought it was quite fascinating where construction companies put their subcontractors on the list, because if you're running, Queen's Wharf as an example, you want to know if your subbies are starting to look a bit shaky or money's owed claims are starting to come on them. They need to know. And I thought that was a very powerful tool for those entities.
That's an interesting one with for a major contractor, often their risk is not themselves getting paid because they now have project bank accounts. A lot of the work may be government work where there's not really risk in terms of not getting paid by the government for completing the project. Where their risk really lies is in their subbies not being able to deliver or falling over halfway through a job.
There's been an interesting risk management because it's not only just insolvency, is it? Like there's all sorts of other things, like there's things like workers' comp type stuff, like any of those sort of injuries, do those sort of things ever pop up?
Yeah, all of those. So, one thing that's interesting to point out is the one data point that the credit bureaus do get from the law courts are basically monetary judgments. So
right.
If I owe you money, you take me to court. If that ultimately results in a monetary judgment against me, that will then eventually appear on my credit file. What we see in practice is the majority of those things are small default judgments where it's a small amount of money. By the time I get a lawyer and sort of go to court and defend myself, I've spent, in some cases many times what the claim is for. So a lot of people just don't sort of bother going through that process. You then end up with what's called a default judgment that appears in the credit reports. What they don't pick up, though, are the much bigger claims, which invariably will get defended, where let's say I owe you a large amount of money. I then will, show up with my lawyer and say, no, there's a big misunderstanding. I don't owe you that, whatever the situation may be. So we see often that what's not in the credit report is actually the more sort of juicy, meaningful data. And sometimes the more meaningful one can be workplace injury. Some of the penalties and consequences of workplace injuries on sites can be business ending. Either the penalty or, what it means for your workplace. We've seen many instances where there'll be a ruling that says, hey, you've had a serious injury at your site. Here are all the rectification things that you need to do to make your site safe.
So there's a gap, but it's not to demean in any way the role of the credit agencies. It's just a source of information that hasn't been tapped effectively previous to Alares.
Exactly right. And look, most of our users in the credit space will use our data in conjunction with a credit report. So we advise all of our users, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You have a process. It's a good process. The credit report's useful. Run our report in conjunction with that to fill that key gap. And what it does is gives people just a much more complete picture of where their risk lies and what they might need to do.
Favourite story about where you've caught something either of you, you've given me one where Oliver blew up a deal with one. Have you got another story that you can think of?
We have many.
Of course we do, yes.
We have many stories, but one that always sort of comes to mind is a lender who came on board with us, and it just so happened that the very first report that they ran, the prospective client who they were going to lend a fairly substantial sum of money to had a money owing claim in the district court that flagged. And so the lender called up and said, look, we've run your report, this is all sort of new uncharted territory for us, but something has flagged. What do I now do? And, we said, well, look, I'm sure that you have an existing process. If something flags in your credit report, you then follow certain steps. Just follow the same process. You've now got another sort of adverse data point. What would your existing process have you do? So we just stepped through that with this lender, and we sort of just stressed the point that, look, you're running our report specifically to find situations, such as this. This happened to be a lend that was going to be, by and large, unsecured. Long story short, the lender did not proceed with this loan. About 2 months later, the prospective borrower entered insolvency. And,
Right.
and as a thank you, this lender sent us an email with a Steve Smith one-handed diving catch in the slips corner and said, thank you very much for...
So I'll win. Well, we might get you to come back and we'll talk to you about sort of how you're using it and what you've seen. I think I'd be really fascinated to know the kind of the intel that you've picked up along the way. So thanks very much for joining us, Patrick. It's been great to have you along, and thanks, Chris, once again. Sounds of the Baskerville.
Thanks.
Thank you.